Yeah.
Yes.
So this talk has come really courtesy of a few of our patients who attend the regular weekly meetings that we have, and it's come up as a bit of a topic in a last few weeks of meetings that we've had, and obviously it's something that is quite useful it's useful at different stages of disease. It's useful in those initial stages of diagnosis, but then it's also got a use kind of further down when symptoms start to change, or perhaps with disease progression, but certainly in relation to respiratory diseases in general, not just aspergillosis, because obviously we understand that the majority of you out there, all of you, in fact, have all got some sort of coexisting respiratory condition. I'm really puzzled by not being able to see anyone. Okay, so what is a symptom diary? So a symptom diary records daily symptoms, flare-up, PRM medication, which is pro-Renata medication. So that's things that you would take in addition to your regular prescribed medication. So things like paracetamol, it might be your reliever inhaler, it might be if you've got rescue packs of steroids or antibiotics. So we'd also look at recording things like exposure to any potential triggers and any lifestyle factors that might influence the condition. So that's things like what's your activity levels like throughout the day, and it can help us look at it kind of as a whole. So it's personal to the individual, and it can in the long run help you better manage your condition. And what are the benefits of a symptom diary? So one of the ways this came up was that in a conversation with a patient, they've been for an appointment, and because there'd been quite a long gap between the two appointments, the patient was concerned that obviously appointment times are relatively short. Most of the time they're 10 minutes. So being able to consolidate what's happened over the time between appointments into one concise conversation with a clinician can be quite difficult. And obviously we can forget things, and we can miss things out, and then you could come out. I mean, how many people have come out of an appointment and said, oh, I forgot to mention this? So by keeping a symptom diary, it can really help that conversation when you go into these clinical appointments. So it's making sure that the symptoms that you are experiencing and any impacts of them, that you're able to communicate them effectively. And it really helps that conversation, that makes for comprehensive discussion, rather than getting a little bit kind of lost and going off on tangents. So it's something that you could have a look at beforehand, prior to your appointment, and it can help focus your thoughts on what you want to discuss when you go in. So another one is self-awareness and monitoring. So by tracking your symptoms and your triggers, you can possibly start to notice patterns and identify things that exacerbate or relieve your symptoms. So it might be a case that if you have an increased level of activity one day, that if you have documented that, but then you've noticed the next day that you're having, your symptoms are worse, or you're more fatigued, or you're more short of breath, it might help you to start to see trends in what you're doing and how, and that's having an effect on the condition itself. So another one's empowerment control. So this is something that, symptom diaries, they're not just something that are kind of thrown out. There's been a lot of studies done on them, particularly in relation to respiratory diseases. So we've seen them with bronchiectasis, COPD, and asthma. And one of the things that comes through in these studies is that by managing a chronic condition with a symptom diary, it helps put you in control, and it's help you're not just being affected by the condition, you're actively monitoring it and looking at it and looking at ways that you can improve it. So it can really give you some control over your own health. It can also help with research and understanding of the condition. So again, a lot of these studies that we've seen, and I'm going to put an article up on aspergillosis.org that'll link to some of these research papers on symptom diaries as well, is that obviously by documenting symptoms, it can help benefit others in the future, because it might highlight something that wasn't considered a symptom, or something that came as a result of a disease. It might, if it's being seen in more than one individual, and you can start putting it together, it can help recognise more of the problems associated with that disease. And then one of the other elements of it is it can help with personalised treatment. So every entry in the symptom diary is really going to help in your clinical team's understanding of the specifics of your condition. And it can be invaluable in developing a treatment plan. So obviously, if you're on antifungal medication, we can see is what you're experiencing, is it a response to a medication that you're taking, or is it a response to the condition? And a symptom of that. So it can really help you look at it, and it can help in developing that treatment plan. One of the areas we've talked about this as well is in relation to secondary adrenal insufficiency, which a lot of people that are on long-term steroids, they can develop. So one of the studies, one of the areas they're looking at with secondary adrenal insufficiency is they're looking at tailored dosing. And I know this is something that we've discussed in our weekly groups. So rather than having the standard dosing of hydrocortisone, with more information about what a patient's day looks like and what could be having an effect on their energy levels in particular, they can look at tailored dosing strategies within that. So where do we start? So one of the things is, I know that I'm someone who sat here telling you about symptom diaries and the benefits of them, and I would probably do one for a week and then I'd forget, or I'd get distracted with something else, or I'd get bored and I'd stop. But one of the things with it is obviously consistency is key. Is the more entries you have in a symptom diary, the more information you have to look at and to understand what the impacts of the condition are. So we'd say try to make entries regularly, whether that's daily or after any significant event related to the condition. Obviously, the detail really matters in it. So this is information about your symptoms. Again, those medication doses we were talking about, exposure to any possible triggers. So we know for those in particular with ABPA, we know that many of you are actually really good with knowing what those triggers are. So have you been in the garden, digging in compost? Have you been walking through leaves? And understanding, what possibly is leading to exacerbations in your symptoms. And another one is it's important to include your mental health with this as well. And then obviously it's not just something for the clinicians to look at, it's for you to look back at as well. So looking back on those, those entries that you put into that diary and helping you to identify, is there any trends in this? Can I see that I am more short of breath when I've done this, or what on the other side of it, what helps improve it? What kind of things should we be looking at recording? So obviously the date and time is pretty straightforward, but quite an important one that people, they could forget. Time is quite important. Symptoms might vary as the day goes on. They may get worse? Are they initially worse upon waking, but then ease throughout the day? And that's an important feature to look at. Symptoms. So obviously we're talking in the context of respiratory conditions. So this is not an exhaustive list, but you'd be looking at things like cough, breathlessness, any chest pain, fever, sputum production, including, obviously the colour, the frequency. Have you had any episodes of hemoptysis? Now, you can do this in a few ways. You could record it on a scale of 1 to 10, in terms, 1 being none, or 10 being the worst, in comparison to what you have on normal days. The thing that when you're recording your symptoms is obviously you need to look at a way of doing that, or choose a way. There's a lot of different types of symptom diaries out there, in different ways that they record them. So the St. George's questionnaire bases it just on it does it on a 3-month period, doesn't it? Yeah. And it's about comparing where you are at different times. But whichever method you use, it's important to be consistent in how you do that. So obviously that helps explaining it to clinicians. Medication. People do forget to take medication, even when you've been on it for years and you have regular medication. note any missed doses, and like I said before, recording any of those ad hoc medications that you're taking. So have you needed to take any paracetamol because you've had a temperature, if you had to use your reliever inhaler, or have you had to start your rescue pack. Environmental exposures. So this is particularly relevant with aspergillosis, and we know the ABPA. So any activities or locations that might have increased the risk of having an exacerbation or a flare-up. Dietary intake, which is going to tie in with what Graham's going to talk about. So food and drink intake's quite an interesting one, which, as I said, Graham's going to go into more detail of. But this could really help identify any dietary triggers or any effects on symptoms, because as many of you know, some food can impact symptoms. Physical activity, so type and duration of physical activity or exercise, and making a note of how that affects your symptoms and how it makes you feel in the time after that as well. Again, mental health, it's always important, I think, to note the effects on your mental health, because we know the effect that stress has on immune response, and when we're placed under repeated levels of stress, that can reduce our immune response. And another important one, sleep quality. So tracking the amount and quality of your sleep, including any disturbances because of symptoms, because again, that can help your clinician develop an understanding. If you're being, broken sleep's not good for anyone. So if your symptoms are causing problems at night, that's going to that's not obviously going to help your fatigue. So it's something that's quite important for your clinicians to know.
So some of you might remember a very similar talk that I gave last year, but this is kind of a shorter and updated version of it. So there's going to be a worldwide Stop Smoking Day next in 2 weeks. So this is just a bit of a hyping that up a bit. So it's called I Know I Should Quit, but so the reason this is quite important for this group is one of the things we do in everybody's first appointment, we ask about history of smoking, and actually smoking is something that is really, really important for people with CPA, because one of the underlying conditions is COPD, and one of the main risk factors for COPD is smoking. So there's a very sort of clear correlation there. Out of NAC patients, about 1 in 10 has never smoked ever. About 2/3 used to smoke, but they don't anymore. And actually, about 1 in 4 of the people we get referred, they are current smokers. And I think there's a lot of shame and really difficult feelings around this, because it's hard to stop smoking. But when you've got aspergillosis and maybe COPD as well, obviously, it's not doing you any good. Probably a lot of people have tried to quit and it's not gone well. And when you're ill, trying to stop smoking, it's such a difficult thing to do when you've already got no energy and you kind of end up sort of emotionally relying on it. It gets really hard. But I'm not going to nag or have a go at anybody that is in that situation. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about what good it can do to quit, or at the very least cut down, and then show you what resources are out there on the NHS. So quitting, it can do a lot of different things for different symptoms. So less mucus, which obviously a lot more comfortable if the less you're coughing up, fewer chest infections and exacerbations, less inflammation in the lungs, so not feeling sort of so tight, or if you have problems with fibrosis, the less inflammation the better. And you can end up feeling like you have a lot more energy, because one of the things that smoking interferes with is it stops you getting enough oxygen around the body. And also it affects lots of different tissues, like the digestive system, it has quite an effect on. And if you're not digesting your food properly, you're not going to feel your best. And if you're getting sort of a lot of problems with acids and things, it can interfere with some of the azole antifungals. So there's a lot of, it's not just lung cancer prevention, it's the absolute day-to-day, what symptoms you have, how you feel all the time, that it can make a big difference to. It can be a bit daunting, just knowing where to start, because I think a lot of people feel like they're just going to be thrown in the deep end. You ask one question and suddenly you're sort of expected to stop cold turkey right now, and that can be a very daunting process to make the first step on. But you can start getting your information together and seeing what's out there, and sort of getting into gear quite easily, actually. So there's an NHS website. It's on part of the Better Health bit of the website. The link's just at the bottom of the screen there. There's a lot of information on there about sort of the process and all the different options and what's the evidence for all the different options. It's a really, really nice website. Or if you'd rather just talk it through with like a real human being, which is sometimes quite nice, there's a national helpline called Smoke Free. So it's 0300 123 1044, and then you can talk to a real person. Or you can talk to your GP. You will be able to find, you'll have a local stop smoking clinic. I think if you follow the link at the bottom, I think there's like a little search thing, so you can find the contact details for your local one. You can talk to your pharmacist. If you have a health visitor, you can talk to them. And if you go into hospital for any reason, there's provision for people who are in hospital who want to either stop smoking completely, which is ideal, or at the very least, like if you go in for surgery or something, there are options for if you just want something to tide you over while you're in hospital, get like some nicotine replacement or whatever. Because things like any kind of medical procedures where you're healing from it, like any kind of surgery or anything, you're going to heal a lot better if you quit, even just while you're healing, just for a few weeks. If you can stop, even just temporarily, you will heal a lot better. And the hospital team, they'll be used to people saying, I'm not quitting forever, but I want to quit while I'm inpatient. So there are lots of different options there. The actual practical side of that, how, like, what can they offer you? There's quite a few different strands to this. So you'll be familiar with nicotine replacement therapy. It's not just patches. There are lots and lots of different options these days. There's like lozenges, or I can't remember all that. There's like a little pouch that you put under your tongue or something. You can get, there's some information on the website as well about whether you can use nicotine vaping as like a harm reduction to be a bit better than smoking, or sort of as a stepping stone to fully quitting. And there's a lot of information on the website about sort of the science behind that, because it's quite a new thing. So the amount of evidence we want more evidence before we properly recommend that to anybody, obviously. There's a medication as well. It's called bupropion, or the brand name's Zyban, and that it's not a nicotine replacement. It has been used as an antidepressant, sort of, or for addictive problems, and it works on the brain, so it makes your brain less sort of in that craving addictive state. There used to be one called Champix, but that isn't available anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, you've got this. So there's two different kinds of medications if you want to use those. Also, the other sort of strand of it is psychological support. So if you want to talk to somebody, like if you use cigarettes as an emotional coping mechanism, you could ask your GP to refer you for talking therapy, which is not necessarily part of the stop smoking service. But if you think that maybe a course of sort of counselling, or like CBT skills or something, if you can if you can find a better way of coping with all the difficult garbage that gets thrown at you from day to day, that could be a really good underpinning. There's a lot of there's something called books on prescription, which is the library has a lot of sort of self-help books that you can read. You can kind of go a bit more at your own pace in your own home, and just find out a lot more about it and find out sort of different techniques for stopping cravings and things. There's peer support groups. Obviously, anybody listening to this knows the benefits of peer support groups, so I won't labour that point. You can have local in-person ones, or there's quite a few on Facebook. And also there's a lot of tips and tricks online. Places like British Heart Foundation, they have a really good one. Just very practical tips. Things like when you make an attempt at quitting, it's a really good idea if you can get like your upholstery clean to get the smell out of it, so you're not kind of being reminded of it all the time. That sort of really practical stuff. Or if you like technology and you've got a smartphone, then there's an NHS quit smoking app that's pretty good as well. And it's not unlike the symptom diary in a way. Actually, it kind of tracks what you've been doing each day, and then it sort of gives you a little bit of a pep talk. It tells you, oh, you saved, what is it, £128 this month. So it can just be a little bit of a nice reminder. And so on Wednesday the 13th, that's when there's going to be a big awareness day called No Smoking Day. So we'll put out, I'll write a couple of tweets that you can share on social media. So that I think there's a few different hashtags. So stop smoking or quit smoking or smoke free are all quite good ones. There's an NHS smoke free Twitter account, which is just on the top right there. So there'll be quite a lot of buzz around it that day.
So to start off with, just the regular commentary on respiratory viruses that I'll just quickly go through. COVID's still declining, essentially. I don't think we did. I did this talk at the beginning of February. So back then, we thought we'd peaked when it was coming down, and it is indeed coming down. So we are approaching the bottom of this, the latest trough, and hopefully it'll stay pretty low. So risks are pretty low. The joint committee that recommend on vaccination for the UK government have put out a recommendation to have a spring vaccine programme. So we may be hearing more of that soon. I don't think the government has responded to that recommendation yet, although they always have. So I imagine there is going to be a vaccine programme coming, just to keep those COVID figures as low as they are. It's only going to be for the over 75s and people with immune difficulties, and I think the very young as well were on the list. And the people with immune difficulties are defined in something called the Green Book, like they have been for the last year or two. Some of you may get the call for the spring vaccine programme, and I would still recommend that you took that this year, because the virus is very low. It is still around there, and as I think on Tuesday there was a patient in one of the groups saying they'd had COVID recently, so it's still out there and you're still vulnerable to infection. So it's worth staying up to date with your vaccinations. So the latest surge has passed. Decline in hospitalisation continues. Risk of hospitalisation is still very low, especially if you're vaccinated and boosted. If concerned, stay protected in all the usual ways. And when you get called, get vaccinated. I don't think we should have anything further to worry about from this COVID beast. I think that's pretty much what I said 2 years ago. So let's wait and see. Other viruses are just worth a mention because there's plenty of them out there at this time of year. Flu was surging when I last talked about this. RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus, mostly affects children. That was peaking and it's now falling away again. Adenovirus is another childhood virus that's low, although it is gradually rising. And rhinovirus itself, one of the commonest viruses that cause the common cold, is still pretty low and falling. So that's kind of useful if you're working out your risk of infection. I know we've just had someone say they had the flu, and that's probably why. The dark black line is the current year. It's now clearly peaked, but that would have been in mid-February, early mid-February, and it's falling away now. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So still lots of flu around. So if you haven't been vaccinated, and by now you probably should have been, then it's worth having. As you say, flu vaccines are about anywhere from 40 to 60, 70% effective in any one year. Some years it's higher than others, but they also are very effective at keeping you out of hospital. This is because there are probably dozens of different flu viruses that circulate every year, and your average vaccination contains about 5 or 6 viruses. So it's a bit of a lottery, and they'll be making the decision which flu shots we'll be getting this year about now, based on which viruses are circulating right now and around the world. So worth keeping an eye on and protecting yourself. That flu virus is dropping quickly. You can see in the background previous years. So some year it actually looks like it's peaked quite a bit lower than other years. This dotted line will be last year. It peaked way up there. This year, much lower. So maybe this particular virus isn't so virulent this year, which would be a good thing. And you can see every year they're all fading out, and we come to about the middle of the year and flu virus disappears at that point. All set for next year or this winter. That's about it about viruses. Now, we picked up, we were having a chat on, I think it was Tuesday, it might have been Thursday, about what I should have a chat about. And there was a lot of talk in that meeting about food intolerances, food allergies and intolerances. And so I thought I would try and do a little talk about those, because I'm very confused about what's what. I'm unclear as to what they are, what they do, and what we do about it, and so on. And only last year, this paper was brought out, which is quite a comprehensive review, and it's very recent. And it's called itself Myths and Facts About Food Intolerance. And I am aware that there's an issue with an awful lot of effectively disinformation out there on the internet about food intolerance. So I thought it was worth going through what we actually know, rather than what people who are trying to run commercial businesses think we should know. So there's a lot to this subject, so I'll go through it piece by piece and try and get it right. I'm exclusively going to talk about food intolerance this time, not food allergy. Food allergy would result in you having rashes, itching, the classic symptoms of allergy, such as a peanut allergy. Food intolerance is a completely different thing, and is worth looking into in some detail to explain what the different types are. So let's have a go. Most adverse reactions to food are patient self-reported and not based on validated tests, but nevertheless lead to dietary restrictions, with patients believing that these restrictions will improve their symptoms and quality of life. This is straight out of the introduction in that paper, and it's addressing what medics believe is a major problem in this area, much as I've just talked about. There are a lot of companies producing various tests, and I'll talk about them a bit later, almost all of which have no evidence that they work and they do what they claim. And what happens is people can buy them online, come up with the test result, believe that they've got to give up certain food types, and then give up more food types if that doesn't work, and so on and so on, and end up on a really quite a poor diet. And doctors are concerned, and the NHS is concerned, that this is a trend that we want to try and stop. These tests don't really tell us anything for certain, and you shouldn't be risking your health by eating a very poor diet as a result of them. We aim to clarify the myths and reality of common food intolerances, giving clinicians a guide. So this was a paper actually written for clinicians that I'm sort of watering down for our sakes. In the last 20 years, cases of adverse reactions to food have significantly increased. And I'm sure we all know someone who's talked about having a food intolerance or a food allergy. Up to 20 to 35% of the Western population reports symptoms after the consumption of different types of food. However, actual food allergy or intolerance are documented in only about a tenth of that number. So there's a big difference. These unspecified reactions, like I've just gone through, can cause long-term dietary restrictions, leading to worse quality of life, eating disorders, and dysbiosis, which is a disruption of the microbial population in your gut that we've talked about on a number of occasions before. So there's a big problem, and this is an attempt to do our bit to address them. And just what I've said, most of these food reactions are not attributed to allergic processes, but are related to intolerances, pharmacologic reactions, and toxic reactions. So, food intolerance, the main cause of reaction to specific food intake in intolerant individuals. And there is a susceptibility in some individuals to these things. And the intolerances seem to be put into 5 categories. There's intolerance to histamine, and I'll go into where we find histamine shortly. Intolerance to gluten, probably one of the most well-known ones. Something called FODMAP foods, which I'll talk about in more detail. Things that I wasn't aware of, fructose has become a focus for food intolerance, and we can do something about that. And the well-known lactose, which is an interesting one because, of course, we're all born with lactose, because lactose is what enables us to break down and benefit from mother's milk. But humans are supposed to shut this down as they get older. Obviously, you don't breastfeed for the rest of your life. The fact that we don't is a very Western feature of the Western population, because we evolved over the last 50,000 years to drink milk from animals as a major food source. Because we've gradually evolved not to shut that down, therefore we can still digest lactose. Part of the problem with people who have difficulties drinking milk is that they have shut their ability to drink milk down, as is normal for the human population up to a few thousand years ago. But starting with gluten, non-celiac gluten. So celiac disease has an immune element to it, so we're not really going to talk about that so much. This is it's called non-celiac. It is a reaction to gluten, so the first patient was identified in the 1980s. It doesn't react immunologically, so there's no antibodies made to the gut, which is what happens in celiac disease. You make antibodies. They make antibodies to attack their own gut and cause a lot of damage. And there's no allergic reaction to wheat. However, when eating gluten, they experience symptoms typical of gut issues such as diarrhea, bloating, stomach pain, and that type of thing. And that seems to be common with all of these food intolerances. With this individual, if they remove gluten from their diet, and it's been well researched that this person, the symptoms stopped very quickly. So there was certainly a problem with gluten, but it was nothing to do with celiac disease. These are 2 different things. subsequently, many people can do this self-diagnosis we're talking about. And even people in my own family, I think, would tell me that they've got gluten sensitivity. They've decided voluntarily to remove gluten from their diet. They say they feel better, but of course they've now removed breads, anything to do with wheat from their diet. If you replace that somehow, then fine. But quite a lot of them don't and end up on a poorer diet. Much better to be properly diagnosed by a doctor. We can actually properly test for this sensitivity, and up to 40% of these actually have celiac disease. So if you've self-diagnosed and you've just removed gluten from your diet, you're also at risk of actually having celiac disease and you haven't been properly treated for it. So it is important that if you have this, if you feel you've got this type of sensitivity, and this is the common theme throughout all of this, go and see a doctor to get examined properly. Now, the FODMAP. FODMAP refers to this exactly: fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. That's what FODMAP stands for. Essentially, these are all things. Saccharides are sugars. The preceding word means oligo. I think oligo literally means 8 or more. Di means 2, mono means 1. So these are all different molecular forms of sugars. They can include fructans, which are sugars from fruit, and also found in various foods, including wheat. Similar thing, slowly absorbed. They rapidly ferment when they get to the gut. And when anything ferments, if you've ever done wine brewing, or beer brewing, you'll know you generate a lot of gas. That's what causes the discomfort in the gut. So essentially, this intolerance seems to be your gut isn't able to cope properly, digest properly certain types of food, and that causes discomfort. It can also trigger the non-celiac disease, which we talked about in the last slide. These are the FODMAP foods. So these are the foods that are rich in all these things. The fructans and galactans are common in this huge range of foods here. The lactoses are obviously milk, yogurts, and cheeses. Fructoses are fruit, honey, so natural sugars essentially. And the mannitols and sorbitols are again fruits, but this time vegetables and sweeteners. You can see if you self-decided that you have FODMAP intolerance and you try to cut out all those foods from your diet, you're going to be pretty poorly and in a very poor. The correct way of doing it is, once again, you know I'm going to say it, go and see your NHS doctor or private doctor for analysis. The symptoms are what I've just said: bloating, abdominal pain, flatulence, whatever that is, and diarrhea. This occurs in susceptible individuals, particularly in patients affected by IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which we all hear a lot about. A large part of irritable bowel syndrome seems to be caused by these food intolerances, from what I've read. And IBS is incredibly common. 20% of people worldwide report some symptoms of IBS. Treatment of FODMAP intolerance, correct treatment once it's been diagnosed. You would go on a low FODMAP diet, so you start off on a diet where you're not eating many of those risky foods. But the important point is you don't stay off them. You start to gradually reintroduce groups of food one at a time. And this would almost certainly be done with your local dietitian at hospital. So you're now bringing back the richness of your diet and assessing which of a much smaller group of foods might be causing your difficulties. In Lauren's case, that could be apples. I'm having apple tonight in a curry, so Now, as this is such a huge range of nutritious food, this process must be done with medical supervision, as I've said, by a dietitian usually, because to stay on a low FODMAP diet is far from a healthy thing for most people to do. This is the little just to show you how long it takes. You go onto the FODMAP elimination, removing all high FODMAP foods, starting at baseline, and that for about 4 weeks you'll be on that diet, but then they'll start to systematically reintroduce food groups back. The process takes about 6 to 10 weeks. And once you've worked out what those few foods are that cause you most problems, you can get back to a personalized diet to carry on with your life, essentially. And hopefully anything that you've removed from your diet, your dietitian will suggest replacements so that you don't suffer nutritionally. Okay, next one. And there's about half a dozen of these as I go through them. These are the ones that we know exist. These are the ones that we've got scientific evidence for, and we can do something about most of them. And we can detect them pretty well, which is an important difference from some of the online testing. Lactose intolerance, we all know, probably all heard of that. Intolerance of the sugar that we find in milk. For the most of us, that would be cow's milk, but also would be in other types of milk. Again, the same pattern of symptoms: abdominal pain, bloating, diarrhea, triggered by consuming lactose in individuals with lactose malabsorption, LM. Lactose deficiency is common, resulting in lactose malabsorption of foods that contain lots of lactose. Okay, so that can be milk or foods containing milk. Doesn't happen all the time. You can have a lactose intolerance which doesn't result in lactose malabsorption, and you probably feel fine. But globally, 68% of people have a lactose malabsorption. So this is incredibly common. Like I say, it addresses the very evolution of humankind. Lactose malabsorption has multiple causes, so you can be genetically predisposed to malabsorption. So you can have a genetic change, which means that you can't process lactose. These are pretty rare, though. Normally, any genetic change, our DNA looks after itself extremely well, and genetic changes like this would only result in a handful of patients with this in the UK. So that's pretty rare, but also this problem, and I think one of the patients on Tuesday was describing something like this, but maybe not with lactose. You have other issues that can cause lactose intolerance: gastroenteritis, chemotherapy, antibiotic usage, a big one for this group, celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease, IBS there again, and other major malnutrition. And these are all things that reduce the absorption surface, so they're interfering with the function of your gut. Something like short bowel syndrome, whatever that is. The good news is, if that has all happened as a result of these treatments, these types of lactose intolerance are usually temporary. Once the situation resolves, once you stop taking antibiotics, maybe you would take when you've taken your antibiotics, you might take probiotics, although we don't know that for sure yet. You can restore the normal function and you can move on from those problems. It's easy to diagnose by your doctor, so it's an obvious place to go. And while you're suffering from it, your doctor would put you on a low lactose diet. Note that it's low lactose, not non-lactose or lactose free. Because milk is a very important part of our Western diet, and you can also buy the enzyme that's faulty and actually take it as an oral therapy, or lactose replacement therapy. Prebiotics can actually stimulate lactase production in a 2022 study, so prebiotics are definitely part of the solution as well. So this is something that can be handled quite nicely by your medical team. Another sugar, fructose. Same story, really. Certain individuals are not able to process fructose properly. The sugar builds up and causes a release of gas, abdominal pain, bloating, diarrhea, and all the rest. Fructose is almost always diagnosed in children, probably because it is normally spotted pretty early. There are two types, hereditary and non-hereditary. So genetic and non-genetic. And it's a sugar found in honey, fruit, some vegetables, and so on. For example, carrots contain a lot of sucrose, and sucrose, as I'll show you in a minute, contains a lot of fructose. So this is where this sugar comes from. It's a very common sugar. As I said before, the hereditary type is rare again because it's a genetic mutation, and genetic mutations are very rare. It's almost always diagnosed in children. Well, it's hereditary, and that's where you'll find it, and it'll be spotted early. Readily diagnosable, so your doctor can detect these properly, and the treatment would be to avoid foods rich in fructose. This causes an issue because this is fruit, which is a food very rich in vitamins and minerals, and very good for our health of most people. So you would supplement with vitamins. This again would be done by your dietitian slowly and carefully. Non-hereditary fructose intolerance is caused by an inability to take up fructose from the gut. Now, this was there's a more complicated explanation of this, which I can't remember. So I have left you with the link to this paper if you want to go and look at this in particular. But basically, it's our gut cannot uptake enough fructose from the gut. If it can't take it from the large I forgot my anatomy. Anyway, it gets further down the gut into the colon. If the fructose arrives in the colon is absolutely stuffed full of your microbiome, and it will eat that sugar like mad, essentially fermenting, and fermentation causes the gas, which causes all the problems. This one is a bit more difficult to diagnose, although it can be done, and it is often treated using the FODMAP elimination diet I've just described. So you eliminate foods, and because you're eliminating fruits and lots of really good foods, it's important to eliminate the smallest number of foods that you can, and to replace anything important that you eliminate with another food that doesn't cause this problem. Again, your dietitian can organize that for you. I would imagine this makes up most of a dietitian's day, actually, this type of thing. Saccharose, sucrose, I've just been talking about, is just another type of sugar. All these sugars are mostly monomers, but sucrose is a dimer, and that means there are two halves joined together. One half is glucose and one half is fructose. If someone is unable to break up glucose from fructose, then it can't be absorbed properly. If you can't do that, again, one of the major causes of this is a rare genetic disorder. Have to have a drink. So you can be genetically unable to do this, and those people often present as IBS, irritable bowel syndrome patients. We can treat this by the breakup of glucose from fructose is done by an enzyme, which are proteins that are very specialized in doing this type of thing, that are in our guts and throughout our bodies. We can actually offer an oral treatment which contains that enzyme to replace the faulty enzyme, and you can help people who have got IBS as a result of sucrose intolerance in that way by just providing an oral enzyme replacement. This is quite a big one again, histone intolerance. A lot of us will be familiar with histone because, as it says down here, there's a lot of histamine produced in people who have ABPA. The IgE release that happens in our ABPA, and there can be many thousand, scores of many thousands in those patients. One of the things it does is to increase histamine release, and that can cause a lot of the issues in those patients. You can also have another way that you can build up histamine in your body is you are unable to break it down. Histamine is produced by virtually every cell in our body, and we are very good at breaking it down, but some people maybe not so good. Mastocytosis is a disease of something called a mast cell, which produces a lot of histamine. If you get too many of them, you'll get too much histamine. I've used the wrong word up here. This is not histone. This should be histamine. The symptoms are itching. It's a lot like an allergic response. Itching, airway constriction, blood vessel dilation are all the same type of response that you would get from an allergy, and that's because an allergic reaction can be triggered, as we know with ABPA, by histamine. Well, in this case, it's not an allergic process causing it. We can't currently diagnose histamine intolerance. So it's a more difficult one to treat. Food intake is something that, again, is looked at quite closely because that is something we can do with relatively safely. Things like mastocytosis are relatively modern scientific subjects. So there's a lot of progress going on in mastocytosis, and so we should see improvements in treating mastocytosis fairly soon. High levels of histamine cause all the usual suspects: abdominal distension. I don't know what postprandial fullness is. Do you know what postprandial fullness is?
After eating.
After eating. Simple as that. Diarrhea, abdominal pain, constipation. It is also linked, though there isn't a proven causal link, with all kinds of things like headaches, dizziness, tachycardia, collapse, skin-related issues like itching, eczema, hives, swelling, a huge range of symptoms caused by an intolerance to histamine, or high levels of histamine, we might say. Treatment, like I said, is largely about controlling diet, because foods contain a lot of histamines. So if we're eating lots of foods that contain a lot of histamines, we can end up with high histamine in the body, and that can cause this issue. So we can go back to the low histamine diet, which pretty much the same process as the FODMAP diet, to lower that exposure. At the moment, I think, if I remember rightly, this is one of the ones that we see a lot on the internet, saying various things will work and various things are known, but actually we don't know very much about how effective this low histamine diet is. There have been a few clinical trials, but they've not been terribly conclusive. So the jury is out on whether food treatment as yet works, but there's not many other things that we can do about it at the moment. There's what we've just been talking about. Keeping a food diary would reveal help reveal histamine intolerance, because you could be linking it to certain foods in your diary. There are a huge number of foods. I think I've got a picture in a minute, just like there are for some of the others, that contain high levels of histamine, or they stimulate histamine release. Like I say, every cell in our body can produce histamine virtually, and some foods stimulate those cells to produce their own histamine. So again, you end up with very high levels. So if we're going to treat this by limiting foods, we need to take great care deciding what to exclude and what food groups to exclude, and to replace anything we do exclude. And this needs medical support from your dietitian. There is some NHS guidance that was written in one of Plymouth hospitals, which you might want to look at, which goes into this in a lot more detail, because it's quite a big subject, and the foods that you have to go through. There must be hundreds of them, so I certainly couldn't list too many of them here. This is an image that shows some of them. So foods rich in histamine, preserved meats, alcohol, sadly, fermented foods. So there's a lot of, we've talked a little bit about using fermented foods as very good for your microbiome. Well, they're also very histamine rich. So if you're having this problem, maybe not such a good idea. Dried fruits, avocado, especially cheese starts off having histamine, but as it ages, so if you're eating a really mature cheese, then you get a lot more histamine out of it, which is worth knowing. Shellfish, spinach, eggplant. Foods that themselves cause ourselves to release histamine, all these things. Alcohol again, sadly. Bananas, tomatoes, wheat germ, beans, chocolate, very sadly. Citrus fruits, strawberries, and so on. Nuts. So this is almost a Mediterranean diet, and we're contemplating eliminating parts of that. So it could be a really, really bad if anyone's going to actually do that. Foods that can inhibit the breakdown of histamines, which would cause higher levels because we're not breaking them down properly. Alcohol, fermented drinks, tea, and energy drinks. So it's almost like a picture of the modern world here in a Mediterranean diet and a few of these. So clearly this has to be done carefully and by professionals if this treatment is going to be used. There are treatments you might hear about. I believe certain types of what do you call them? Medical treatments, sort of functional doctors, that type of peripheral type medical treatment will often use antihistamines. They work in part, but their effectiveness still remains unclear. A lot more research needs to be done. We can stabilize mast cells with a particular drug, but we've got absolutely no idea if that works. So if anyone tells you that this is the treatment, they're wrong. We can also attempt to stimulate breakdown, so the opposite of the substances that we were just looking at. With some oral substances, this is essentially research, so we certainly can't recommend any of those attempts at the moment, so I won't name those. So that's it for the ones that we know a lot about. There are, as you probably suspect, a lot of other foods that people claim sounds a bit cynical. People feel that they are intolerant to. However, we don't really have a lot of evidence that other foods intolerance exist. A lot of that's probably down to the difficulty doing the research, and as time goes on, we will probably find more. The diagnostic tests are very difficult to use. Medical tests have to be validated for use in NHS clinics. And what that means is we need to know how they work, if they work well, and how to use them to their best effect. If we don't know any of those things, then we won't use them in clinic, because if they're not reproducible, then we can't know when our treatments are working. So those tests are not used in clinic until they're validated. High levels of self-diagnosis, like we said at the start, people are just taking some of these tests, saying, "Oh, I'm intolerant to apple, perhaps," and then they start eliminating foods and food groups on their own. This particularly happens with IBS patients, irritable bowel syndrome patients. For reasons we've gone over repeatedly, that's not a great idea. These can sometimes have harmful effects, so should only be attempted with medical supervision. This is a very complex area. There are literally thousands of foods that you have to go through for these intolerances. And the full paper that I've just been summarizing is there, and I think it was also at the start on the first slide. Some of these tests that you will come across online, which this is just a short list that I came up with this morning. They claim, the people who are selling these, often at quite a high price, are claiming that all of these things will test food intolerance. Everything from looking at white blood cells releasing mediator molecules, which might work, but it's certainly highly specialised. Immune cell testing, looking at toxicity to in vitro to cells, skin conductivity tests, hair analysis, iris patterns, something called energy frequencies. No idea what that might be. Just looking at your heart rate. When you eat a food, does your heart rate go up? That's totally unreliable. Provoking by putting small amounts of the food under your tongue, sublingually or intradermal, to try and provoke responses. And something that sounds completely unfeasible, electric cell substrate impedance sensing. These are things you will all find offering tests for intolerance on the internet at quite high prices. None of them work to our knowledge. Save your money. Conclusion. There are several food intolerances we can accurately diagnose. I've just gone through the list. Your dietitian can work with you to ensure that you still have a full good diet when you've identified the foods that are causing the problem. To base food elimination on unvalidated tests is a bad idea and lead to a poor diet. You need to do these things through your doctors if you suspect that you have an intolerance, and they will lead you, and then the dietitian will lead you through the processes that are required to help them clear up.